Okay, good morning. I will continue after the introduction by Massimo. So the question is a little bit, what are the different components? What are the building blocks of such a European harmonized wildlife monitoring? And as yesterday said by Joachim, it's mainly within the framework of wildlife management, wherever this management is aiming at can be conservation, crop damage, or whatever. So I think the question is, what should we be monitoring, or phrased another way, which elements should this monitoring covering or being covering, and what questions should we be able to answer? Now, the good news, same time the bad news or the difficulties, the many frameworks and many people already out there thinking about it. I think we had yesterday with Europabon, one of the examples. Mentioned some frameworks. The post-2020 indicators work is being done recently at the COP meeting. There was a framework developed for biodiversity monitoring in the Convention on Global Biodiversity. And yesterday with the geese, I think we had a very beautiful example of adaptive impact management. And there are 4 more of them. So all of those people are together with us or apart from us simultaneously thinking about what should we monitor and which information do we need in the framework of wildlife management. So if I look at the COP and at the Convention of Biological Diversity, there's the aspect of sustainability, and it's very clear one of the conditions for wildlife management is that the management should be sustainable. On one hand, it's to avoid your overexploitation of species. Quite often people only think about the species itself, but quite clearly the COP also mentioned the non-target species also, the whole ecosystem. But at the same time, we should allow local communities and other people to continue to use. So this means that we need information on what's the current use, being it hunting, being it management, being it culling, how are animals used and what's the impact. Now, very normally quite often we find this kind of graphs where people say we should monitor the use on one hand and independent of the use. And it's quite often one of the problems we have when we use bag statistics as a proxy for abundance is that we use, in fact, the use as a measure to measure the population. And in order to assess sustainability, we should have them independent, one from the other one. And these are the classical possible situations. The use goes up, the population goes down, which looks a little bit like overexploitation. Both go up, both go down, the use go down, and the species goes up. Now, only looking at overexploitation, it would be bad to have a use going up and another species and the population going down. But talking about sustainability and looking at the wild boar issue and many others, looking at disease management, quite often we would like to see the use going up and the population going down. So I think we should not forget that the framework, we need both of them independent, but it's not so obvious which is the right answer always, or the right situation always. And I think Massimo already also said some, with all the different stakeholders, it could be that for one stakeholder who would like to be in scenario A and the other ones would like to be in another scenario. Avoiding the negative impact on other species also means that we don't only have to measure the population trends of the species we're managing, but also of other species, which makes it a little bit more complex. And quite often we forget that if we talk about sustainability, we should also measure the socio-economic aspects. So it's far more, and for me, it's a little bit of a question from previous talks talking about a European Biodiversity Monitoring Center. We will need to monitor a lot more than only the biodiversity if we're talking about wildlife management. How are we going to solve this? Still a question. It brings us automatically also the following one. The convention also, or in the recent changes in the Convention on Biological Diversity, there was a part added, which is the last part, effectively manage human-wildlife interactions to minimize human-wildlife conflict and going towards coexistence. So it's in there right now. It was a long discussion to get it in there, and now starts even a bigger discussion on what it means, and even more on how are we going to monitor if we're going in the right direction. Lucky us, there is something which is called the Human Wildlife Coexistence, a conflict specialist group, part of the IUCN, and they're dealing with the same question. What are we going to monitor and how are we going to do this? The first thing is very easy, or not easy, it's very obvious. If we're talking about reducing human-wildlife conflicts, we have to have an ID, indicators, whatever, for the negative impacts, who are quite often responsible for those conflicts. So it means measuring vehicle collisions, crop damage, damage to forestry, diseases, the number of cases, the number of outbreaks. But at that moment, we're only talking about negative impacts and indices. And it's very clear, if I go back, the aim is to go towards coexistence. So if that's the aim, and getting back to some of the talks yesterday morning, when we were working on communication, we should also find a way of measuring if we are really going towards coexistence. Because it could be that we are reducing the number of accidents, but the coexistence is not going in the right direction. So there we will definitely need another kind of data, and also Massimo already, which is going about, are we moving towards more tolerance, or what are the perceptions? People feeling that it's going the right way. And also directly, this means we have to measure some preferences. Are people happy about what's happening? Is the conflict reduced on the way we're doing it? And then even to make life a little bit more difficult, the IUCN also said, and what's very important in this is measuring the process. Is this done on a fair way and a right way, or is this top down? How are we dealing with this? The IUCN clearly states also, and I'm not going to go into all 5 of them, but I think the third one is quite important. If we would like to reduce human-wildlife conflicts by wildlife management, the human and the social aspects, quite often they're not very clear. We don't know even where they are. So we're very surprised to see that we're managing, but we're not reducing the conflict, although the indices are showing that there are less accidents or whatever. So we should be able to measure them, because there is the real aim. And I really like this graph of Alexander Zimmermann of IUCN, who says we're quite often we're measuring this part of the story. What are the impacts? Where are the impacts? What's the loss? Where the real conflict is there. It's a conflict between people. So we should be able to measure also that part of the story. Otherwise, we're measuring the wrong part of the story. So there's the second axe. And then the third one, who was also mentioned yesterday, it's the adaptive impact management. And Joachim also mentioned it. We would like to measure be able to evaluate if we're doing the right management and how to change it. So we need some causes. But the first condition is, and again, I wonder if the Biodiversity Center will monitor this, we need to monitor the current management. Otherwise, it's very hard to say how to adapt to current management. So we need information on hunting days. We have been discussing it within ENETWILD. Are we going to count the number of days, the number of hunters? What about beaters? What about dogs? What about all the different systems of hunting, going from drive hunting to individual hunting? What about all the management, which is not hunting, but which is really management, which is culling, which is trapping? Yeah, it's quite of a challenge. Apart from this, there is, of course, the question, what about all our preventive actions? What about the fencing? Is it working? How much fencing is that done? What about scaring away animals? So there's a lot of information we will need if the aim of the monitoring in Europe is to be able to change the management. Otherwise, it's a big black box, and we can only say not right, but we don't know what to change. And also the communication, this was mentioned yesterday also. I think communication is a crucial part of what management is or should be. It's not something separate, it's part of the management plan. So it should also be monitored. Is there more communication? And is this bringing us closer to coexistence, less conflicts, whatever? If we're talking about adaptive impact management, which also means that we have to monitor the impacts. If we're talking about the human-wildlife conflicts, I already mentioned it. It's clear, it's a negative impact. But if we're talking about impact management, we should also measure the positive impacts. Otherwise, we're only looking at half of the story. So what about venison hunting, wildlife viewing, human well-being, all those elements? So there are quite some elements there, and we could discuss, and in the workshops also we can discuss in those 3 pillars, or do we need other pillars, or how do we organize this? Personally, I think we should not waste too much time in this frame. The big question is, what are the topics? And I think we listed part of it, but surely there's some gaps still. What kind of indicators can be used to measure those topics? And then, as Massimo say, how are we going to go from the local level to the European level? Because it can be a completely different indicator in where you're going to measure on a local scale to what we need on a European scale. So I think this is surely a frame or a table to take with us to the workshops. So yes, there are the workshops this afternoon, and we have quite some challenges and some questions I would like to give with you. One mentioned by Massimo already is there is a big difference between where are we collecting the data, and we would like to use them on a European level. So we would also like to use them on the different scales, but also on the European level. So it's a different level where we are, a different scale where we're going to collect them as where we're going to use them. It's a big challenge. Another challenge will be keep it simple. I've been looking at many of the indicators also of the post 2020. It's long lists, it's many possibilities. We heard yesterday a little bit of the budget for the geese. It's only 1 species. And now we're talking about plenty of species. So how are we going to keep this simple? I think one of the questions to answer or to look at the workshops are we going to standardize the data from the beginning? So impose a standard which everybody has to use to collect data? Or are we going to look a little bit like the Living Planet Index to methods to look at trends from local data and how we can aggregate trends on a European level? It's a completely different way of working. It has advantages, it has disadvantages we will have to look at. We should not reinvent the wheel. I think in the already yesterday became clear that there are many initiatives, and before deciding to do something, we should know what other people have been thinking about. And I think another challenge will be how do we avoid doing something someone else is doing? How do we avoid overlapping a little bit, resulting in what Camilla was saying yesterday, that we maybe do something which someone else is doing on a little bit different way, and we then result with different figures based on who you are asking. We should try to prevent this all time and try to integrate existing knowledge. And the final one for me is a very important one. I was presenting you all different components of a wildlife monitoring in Europe with many different subcomponents. How are we going to be sure that we collect the data we need? And not only the data that are available or that we like or that we're interested in, but that we're sure that we have all the components to allow evaluating and adapting of wildlife management. So that's for it for now. And I leave the floor to Thomas, who will now explain how we will measure all these questions.